Kant, so he's about a generation before. Like utilitarianism, it's best to understand Kant's theory as a narrow sense moral theory, instead of a broad sense moral theory. As we've seen before, broad sense moral theory is one which gives us a substantive concept of the good, something to live for, what the good life is. Aristotle's theory would be an example of this. Aristotle says the good, or the good life, is that which involves friendship and contemplation. Kant, like the utilitarians, as a narrow sense moral theory, is interested not in ends, not in what constitutes the good as something that's external to us, but rather the structure of ethical relations. He wanted to understand rational agency, what it is to act for a reason, or just to act for a reason that one gives oneself. We'll get into this a bit more deeply. If he succeeds in doing this, then, like the utilitarians, he'll give us ultimately ethical principles, or one in particular, that we can use for making decisions. Kant gives us our concept of autonomy that we'll make more of later on. We'll discuss autonomy in the context of professions. What it is to be a profession is to demand within the profession autonomous judgment. Kant gives us primarily, though, and fundamentally, the concept of autonomy as self-direction. So what the autonomous moral agent is. We can understand this in terms of responsibility, what it is to be accountable for one's actions. Kant also used, though, the concept of autonomy with respect to morality itself. He gives us an argument for why morality is autonomous. That is, what this means is that there is no reason for being moral, that there is no reason outside of morality that would motivate morality itself. Morality's motivation is self-contained. There's actually a simple argument for this. Any reason for being moral would have to be either a moral reason or a non-moral reason. That kind of exhausts the possibilities. If it's a moral reason for being moral, then it can't really be a reason for being moral, since you'd already have to be morally motivated to accept it. So you'd already be there. You don't need a reason if you're within morality already. If it's a non-moral reason for being moral, say like pleasure or happiness, then you can't get there from here. That he says a non-moral reason can't be a reason for being moral. Morality requires a purity of motive, a basically moral outlook, which is destroyed by any non-moral motivation. Hence, he says there can be no reason for being moral. Morality presents itself as an unmediated demand, a categorical imperative, which will turn out to be the name of his moral principle. So the source of moral value for Kant is what he calls the goodwill. As he says in the piece by Kant in the book by Timmins, Conduct and Character, the only good thing in the world is a goodwill. That is, the only good thing in the world, good without qualification, just good in itself, is a goodwill. And by goodwill, Kant does not mean peace on earth, goodwill toward men. That is, being nice. He means the capacity to make right decisions. Well, think about that. That's an odd thing to say, isn't it? The only truly good thing in the world, good without qualification, is a goodwill. I'm sure there aren't many people for whom that would be the first thing that they would think. What about the other things? What about other things that we see are admirable in human beings? Intelligence, wit, judgment, other talents of the mind, virtues, courage, perseverance, resolve. Kant says all of those can be put to bad uses. Power and wealth can corrupt. Even health and happiness can inspire pride, one of the 7 deadly sins. It all depends on the uses to which you put those, and their uses are determined by character. Even the traits that Aristotle admired, moderation, self-control, deliberation, Kant says all of those can be put to bad uses. We can have cool and calculating criminals, after all. So he says a goodwill is good not because of what it brings about. It's not good instrumentally. It's simply good by virtue of its willing. It's good in itself. It's intrinsically good. Even the inept will, even somebody who bungles everything they set out to do, is or can be good by virtue of its willing. Now, contrast that with the utilitarians. On the face of it, for utilitarians, you can do the right thing accidentally, even, since it's the world that determines what makes one's actions right. The good will does intend to do good. And then he says, so that first main statement, again, is the only thing in the world that's good without qualification is a good will. Then he says, the conception of law as motivation for action is the supreme good. I said, well, wait a minute, Kant, you said the good will is the supreme good. And he says, yes, but this is how it does it. So the good will bases its actions on the conception of law. And we're basically quoting Kant on this. Okay. What kind of law can this be? Whose just the idea of it alone is good, without regard to the consequences of acting on the basis of this law. He's already said that the good will itself is the only good thing. So he's ruled out any impulses that arise from obedience to any particular law. Well, to cut to the quick here, he said, okay, what is this law, Kant? Tell us and we'll be happy. And this is an applied ethics course. We just want something we can use. What is this law whose conception alone makes it good without regard for its effects? And he says, well, right there, I can't tell you that. He says, what you want, Kant says, is a target. You want something to aim at. And I've already told you that the good is in here, the good will. If I gave you a target, that would make the goodness of your action, the rightness of your action, derivative from the goodness of something outside of yourself. And we've already precluded that. Okay, great. So what law can this be? If this is no law in particular, what law can this be? This sounds discouraging at this point. We're moving quite fast, but that's all right for us. So what law can this be if it's no law in particular? Kant says it's merely the idea of law following. And that is categorical imperative right away, which is this. It said there are actually two forms of the categorical imperative. The first is this. You'll notice on the slides, you could get both forms. First form is always act in such a way that you could also will the maxim of your action to be a universal law. Now, maxim is not a word we use too much anymore. It is the part of one's reason for acting that you can abstract and apply to anyone else, and allow anyone else to use this. There are, in Kant's theory, he actually has 5 forms of the categorical imperative that he says are all equivalent. We don't run into more than 2 very often, but the second one is interesting. Does always treat persons as ends, never merely as means. In other words, don't treat people like things. Don't treat them as tools. Don't treat them just as ends, as a means to your own ends. Notice in this form, he says, never treat people merely as means. Of course, he acknowledges that we need to depend on the other people, division of labor and so on. But he says what he means is don't treat them merely as things, not just as things, not just as means to our own ends. The reason for this becomes evident later, but it's dignity, that each person is an embodiment of the goodwill and therefore deserves commands, our respect. Each person has dignity. He believed that this captures our common moral thinking. And he has a famous example of this, the lying promise. Let's consider that. When I'm in a bind, should I make a promise that I have no intention of keeping? No, depending on what the bind is, if making a lying promise, a false promise, is something that gets me out of it, that's a good idea. It sounds on the face of it, it gets me out of the bind. But then I think about it a bit more, and I realize that if I do this, make a promise that I don't intend to keep, that it will destroy my credibility ultimately, which is more important to me in the long run. Now, Kant would say that's more enlightened, really. It's thought about it a bit more deeply, but it's still wrong-headed. What he has in mind then is that remember the categorical imperative in the first form. Always act in such a way that you could also will the maxim of your action, the reason for your action, a universal law. That is, whatever my reason is, if it's justifiable reason, then it's justifiable for anyone else to use. So if I make a promise that I have no intention of keeping, I would have to allow that anyone else in a similar situation could also make a promise that they have no intention of keeping. And I also allow them to do the same sort of thinking that I'm doing. Now, what would happen to promising? What would happen to the institution of promising if we allowed everybody to make promises they don't intend to keep? It would be meaningless, wouldn't it? It would be self-defeating to, as we'll say later on, universalize a false promise. And that's exactly his point. It would be illogical. It would be a self-defeating practice to make promises that we don't intend to keep and allowed everyone else to use the same thought process as we are. Well, before we go further, we should consider that there are two kinds of imperative, the categorical imperative and the hypothetical imperative. The hypothetical imperative is also an imperative of reason. It's rational. It has the form of an if statement, though. If you want X, do Y. So the force of the imperative, the command, is entirely based on your accepting or a desire for what's in the antecedent, the X part. If you want X, do Y. You must want X before you see the necessity of doing Y. So hypothetical imperatives are essentially counsels or maxims of prudence. The categorical imperative, on the other hand, is simply has the form of do Y, period. There are no ifs. It's a command of reason that we see is simply necessary, that reason demands of us independently of anything else that we want. We mentioned the goodwill. Let's consider the nature of wills again. Kant says that there are two kinds of will, the goodwill and the holy will, and they're distinguished by their sources of motivation. The goodwill has two sources of motivation, reason and desire, that it can use on any given occasion. The holy will has one source of motivation, reason alone. Now, so the holy will is somebody who's completely rational. Everything they do is rational. It wouldn't occur to the holy will to do anything that's not rational. And in particular, everything that the holy will does, that it decides, conforms to the categorical imperative. That's why it's holy. Can you think of anyone like this? Try science fiction. How about Star Trek? Who in Star Trek is completely rational? Well, depending on what generation of Star Trek we're looking at. So how about Spock? Spock would be an example of the holy will. Everything Spock does is rational. Wouldn't consider, that's the thing, he wouldn't consider doing anything that's irrational. He arches his eyebrow at humans who are emotional and driven by desire. Kirk is the goodwill. Kirk is rational. He wouldn't be a captain if he weren't, but he's human and he has desires. And reason conflicts with desire. This is the essential point upon which everything is based in Kant's ethics. The goodwill, us, and remember he says morally, the only thing in the world that's good without qualification is a goodwill. The goodwill is us, and morality is for us as we are. Morality is a matter of the conflict of these two sources of motivation that are within us, reason and desire. And we can overcome desire. Kant was extremely impressed by this, that we have the capacity to overcome our desire. Everything else in the world that behaves, notice behaves, not acts, behaves according to some internal programming, animals' instinct, machines' actual programming. It's only persons who have the capacity to act to overcome their desires on the basis of something else. Persons for Kant could mean, well, for Kant in the 18th century, perhaps angels. He would have thought angels as persons. In our time, we can see maybe AI as an example of a person at some point in its development. Now the question is, what do we make? What generalization can we make about the holy will? Now, on the first exam, there will be two questions about Kant that if you can answer one, you can answer the other. And these probably are the two most difficult questions. So let's look at this carefully. What generalization can we make about the holy will, about the praiseworthiness of the holy will? It's holy after all. Why is it holy? Because everything it does conforms to the categorical imperative. Everything the holy will does is something that the holy will could allow anyone else to do. The answer, though, is that the holy will is not praiseworthy. It's somewhat surprising. Why is that? Because it overcomes no conflict. It experiences no conflict. It automatically does what accords with reason. Doesn't do any work, in other words. So the goodwill deserves praise because it does overcome conflict. So the point here is that the way desire, the relevance of desire and reason is their potential conflict. That the praiseworthy moral action is one that involves a conflict of reason and desire within the human being, and that person overcomes the conflict by doing what reason commands over what is desired. That Kant would said that that's extremely it's praiseworthy, it's surprising. It is in fact what gives us our dignity. It is what makes people worthy of respect. Is that capacity? That is what freedom is. Freedom is the capacity to overcome desire, and that's what makes an action praiseworthy for Kant. Now, a bit about just briefly imperatives. Well, we said hypothetical and categorical, right? Next. Yes, so there are two questions. So that's the first. What generalization can we make about praiseworthiness of the holy will? It is not praiseworthy because it doesn't overcome desire. It doesn't do any work. So we need to be careful here. It is not that the goodwill not only sees that, well, let's consider duty. Here's the other question. Kant says, only actions done from a sense of duty have moral worth. That is, only actions done from a sense of duty are morally praiseworthy. Why is that? Well, we know that another way of looking at the reason why the holy will does not deserve praise is that it has no sense of duty. It automatically does what it does. It doesn't occur to it to do otherwise. When one does something from duty, one does it because we see that it's necessary. The holy will has no choice. The good will does and chooses to do its duty. The next thing is to see how he did. Where does the categorical imperative come from? Because by this point we understand what it is. That it involves this generalization of the reason for one's action, such that we can allow anyone else to do the same thing, and that it's the categorical imperative is an imperative for the goodwill, because the goodwill does have a choice to do other than what reason commands. And why does the goodwill do what reason commands? Because it is one's duty, rationally. So where does categorical? How does Kant get the categorical imperative? Let's consider. We said that what Kant wants to do in his ethics is to understand rational agency. So let's look at it this way. Let's ask the question: is there anything that rational agents want necessarily? That is, by virtue of being a rational agent. What is it that any rational agent wants? Just in the concept of rational agency. Well, what's an agent? Somebody who acts. Well, somebody who acts is looking for an outcome, some result, something that isn't here now. And well, that much anyone. That's trivially true. Just in the idea of what an outcome is and a goal. Even utilitarians would allow that. Kant now says something that is interesting. He says we want to cause the outcome. Let's consider that. There's some things that have value for us regardless of how we get them. Money. If somebody gives us money or we find it, it's just as valuable as if we go out and earn it. There are some things that we don't want to be the cause of. We want something to happen, but we don't make it happen. We're not the cause of it. Like having someone fall in love with you. You don't want that to happen because you give them an aphrodisiac or program their brain somehow. You want it to happen because of the kind of person that you are. You want it to happen naturally. But then there are things that we want to happen just because we make it happen. Athletic events are like this. Let's say you're in a summer softball league and you're going to play your arch rival. You're anticipating the game greatly. Game day arrives finally, and the opposing team doesn't field enough players. Not enough show up. They forfeit. You get the win in your column, but you feel cheated because the point is not just to get the win; it's to beat them. That's what rational agents want. Is, for one thing, is to cause the outcome. Now, what does it mean to cause the outcome? Because Kant says, because you have a desire for it, you have to want it. Because we believe certain things. That is, we know what it is required to make something happen. Street physics, more or less. And that we act as we do on the basis of those beliefs. All right, so consider. let's say a small kid, say a 3-year-old, knows that when Sesame Street is over or some program, and he turns off the TV, that supper appears on the table. That there's this coordination that when Sesame Street is over, supper appears on the table. It's a good human that to cause something is just a constant conjunction of two events. A is always followed B, therefore it's cause of B. Well, of course, that's wrong. Mom knows this. Mom knows what it takes to make something happen. Let's say that the TV is an old analog set. On old televisions, you had to adjust the picture occasionally with, you'd have the vertical holds. All right, so the picture is screwy. Mom comes over to adjust the set, and she turns the right dial, and the picture clears up. Now, unknown to her, it's an old set. The knob doesn't work anymore, and it's just a cosmic coincidence that the picture clears up at the same time that she turns the knob. She has the right beliefs about how the world works, and she's done the right thing. She's turned the knob, but the world hasn't behaved in the way it should. That is, so to act on the way we do on the basis of those beliefs is kind of a gloss. We'd have to work that out somehow. And lastly, what is it the rational agents want? This is the most important ethically. Rational agents want other people not to interfere with them. We don't want to be frustrated by others. You put all these things together. That is, we want to be the cause of the outcome and all what that means. And we want other people to leave us alone. What do rational agents want? Freedom. All of these constitute freedom. But interestingly, Kant is saying that freedom has a positive dimension. You know, we generally think of freedom as having other people leave us alone. But of course, that's not enough. We have to be able to get up and do the thing ourselves, even if people leaving us alone is not sufficient. We need to be able to do the thing. Kant understood that. So he has a concept of freedom that is particular or peculiar to us in our world. We can think of other worlds where people can have things happen for other reasons. For example, there's a painting by Peter Bruegel, a Renaissance Flemish painter, called In the Land of Cocaine. Not that kind of cocaine. This is Cocaine. Okay, so Bruegel was a great painter, and he painted many allegorical paintings. So in this particular painting, there's in cocaine, you get what you want just because you want it. You don't have to make things happen. So in the foreground of the painting are some, well-fed people lying on the ground with their mouths open, and food is falling out of the sky into their mouths. So they get what they want just because they want it. Well, we don't live in a place like that. In our world, to get something, you have to go out and make it happen yourself. Kant understood that. So he has a concept of freedom that is particular to the kind of world that we live in. Now, so far, Kant has seemed kind of modest in his aims. But now, what he wants to do is to get a commitment to freedom out of prudence. He says, if you're able to act on the basis of self-interest, if you're able to act for a reason that you choose to accomplish self-interest, you are committed to morality thereby. That's a big deal. Let's see how he does it. Here's in brief how the argument goes. And then we'll look at it schematically. There will be a slide that goes through these steps. Every agent, Kant would say, has to think like this. Since I necessarily want my basic freedom, we've just established that. All rational agents want their freedom. I have to be opposed to courses of action which would remove it. I must claim a right to my basic freedom. So I lay down a rule for other people that they respect my freedom just because I am an agent with purposes. So if I have goals, if I have things I want to do, that implies that I want my freedom. And if I want my freedom, Kant says, that means that I must make it a rule, a law, that other people respect my freedom and leave me alone. But, and here's the kicker, if that claim is legitimate, then I am obliged to recognize that other people are in the position to make the same claim of me. And if that's correct, then each person's basic needs and wants commit that person into stepping into morality. And in Kant's case, it's a morality of rights and duties. Again, we said that that's a pretty big deal if he can pull this off. Let's just look a bit more at this in brief. So on the slide, basically the argument is given. I have goals. I have things I want to do. I need freedom to pursue my goals, so I need freedom. Next, I prescribe then, Kant says. That is, I make it a law. Let others not interfere with my freedom. Let's call the agent A, lowercase a, and we'll call this prescription, let others not interfere with my freedom, P. Then A also thinks P of A, me, A, making this prescription for others, is reasonable. It's reasonably related to my being a rational agent. Who is he talking to? For whom is he making this law? Let's call this X. It's the variable X. X thinks, though, P of X is reasonable. X thinks that X making this prescription is reasonable. And for whom is he making the prescription? Among others, A. Now the question is, Bernard Williams gives us this argument. What must A think of P of X? Kant says, well, of course, immediately. A will see that if I can make this prescription for others, then they can make the same of me. But Williams, for one, suggests not so fast. The intermediate position is to say, well, if I were X, then I would want me, A, to stay out of his way. But I'm not. I'm A. I just want him to stay out of my way. So it's not immediately clear that Kant is right there. That he's saying that we're motivated by reason. He's a little more sanguine about that than we are, I think. But don't worry about that. What we do need to worry about is what the prescription is. P, let others not interfere with my freedom, is just a schema. That's what it is. That's what we want the law, the prescription that we give others to do. What does the prescription need to be? The final question for us. So, in other words, what law should A prescribe? Well, what kind of law is this? There is no sanction. No one's going to be punished for disobeying this law. They're going to obey it just because it's reasonable. Well, all right, so we modify the question gradually. Now the question becomes not what law should I prescribe, but what law could I reasonably expect others to accept? So that they're going to accept this law just because it is reasonable, not because they're going to be punished, but because it makes sense. Well, how am I going to find this out? Do I need to go out and do some social science, do some empirical research? No, this is purely logical. So I'm rational. I can ask myself, what law could I accept? And if we can get to that point, if from what law should there be, to what law could I reasonably expect others to accept, to what law could I accept, then I can dispense with the pronouns altogether. Not just what law, now it becomes what law should there be. It just doesn't matter any longer who one is, whether it's me, someone else, the law is rational, it's acceptable just because it's rational. What law should there be? And his answer is a categorical imperative. But notice what's happened here. All the work the important work is in collapsing that distinction between others and myself. what law could I reasonably expect others to accept, to what law could I accept. If we can see that, all that matters is the rationality of the law. Then it doesn't matter which end of the equation you're on, whether you are the actor or the patient, the person performing the action or the person being affected by the action. It makes no difference with respect to rationality. This is a sublime moment in Western cultural history. I think Kant believed that we can see this and that we would act on the basis of this and accept such prescriptions just because they're rational. In this way, he's similar to Bentham. Bentham similarly believed that once we see the category, the principle of utility, that its rational basis, that we would be willing immediately to make the good of all our end. This is all very abstract, admittedly, and to make it a bit more clear, to bring it down to earth a bit, we're going to turn next in the next lecture to John Rawls, the 20th century political philosopher, who in his A Theory of Justice gives us a contemporary Kantian position. So we'll turn to Rawls next time.